Welcome to the Recruitment Hackers Podcast, a show about innovations, technology, and leaders in the recruitment industry. Brought to you by Talkpush, the leading recruitment automation platform.
Hello, and welcome back to the Recruitment Hackers Podcast. I'm your host, Max Armbruster, and on today's show, I'm delighted to welcome Tim Freestone, who is the founder of Alooba, a tech startup based in Australia, but I gather your team is spread out all over the world, which is specialized in helping companies hire data scientists, engineers, architects, and all the people that deal with data. And if you live in the same world that I do, that share of the employment workforce is always growing, and every company needs them. So I'll be asking Tim about how to attract and how to interview this talent. And welcome to the show, Tim.
Thanks for having me, Max. It's great to be here from a very sunny afternoon in Sydney.
Great. Great to be connected. So Tim, tell us a little bit about yourself to begin with. How did you end up well, maybe we'll start with your company, Alooba. Did I describe it okay? Is it an attraction methodology? It's more of a screening methodology or tool, right? For this type?
So we basically assess people's skills in analytics, data science, and two main use cases for that. One is definitely that hiring use case, which you mentioned. And so companies would use our product typically either as a very short initial screening quiz that they would send to every applicant who applies for one of their data roles. And that will be a customized assessment on our platform, assessing things like statistics, machine learning, visualizations, really depends on the role. And that's kind of one half of the company. The other half is really around assessing people's skills internally within a business, trying to find the strengths and weaknesses. And that's most often being used in conjunction with a data literacy strategy. So it's becoming bigger and bigger these days that, you might be a data scientist and have really advanced skills, but what about the 99% of a company who aren't data scientists? What kind of data skills do they need? And so a lot of businesses realize that everyone needs some basic data literacy. And so we often get involved at the starting points of putting in place that learning and development plan. And we really come in as that measurement tool to understand, okay, what's our current benchmark? And then keep measuring through time to see, hopefully, that they've had some improvement in their data literacy.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. I was advised for my business to put a portion of our account management team on things like learning how to use SQL and getting training like that. So I guess I've put it out to my employees as a good recommendation, but I haven't enforced it. But, in bigger companies, you're seeing data literacy being enforced at the corporate level and pushed across departments. Is that a good example, like an SQL training?
I would say SQL would probably fit into the relatively advanced part of data literacy. So there'd be things that are even more basic or simple than that would normally form part of that program. It could be things like, hey, what metric should I be looking at to answer these types of problems? Understanding basic ideas around like sample size. So, if you're reading a report and you see that, I don't know, the number of bookings in England went up by 50%, but to look at that and say, actually, they went from 2 to 3. So that doesn't really mean much if the bookings have gone from 2 to 3, right? And just having that kind of understanding of the basics of data, really.
Yeah, I suppose that there's such a wide gap between the experts and the beginners. You got to lift people so that they don't say anything stupid to begin with, like use 2 decimal points on a percentage when you're basic, like you said, on a sample size of 2 or 3, stuff like that. Great. Well, how did you end up, launching Alooba? It sounds like this is something personal, a problem that you wanted to fix for yourself.
It definitely is. It's like the confluence of the last 10 years of my life, really, is this business. So the last role I was in was at a tech company. I was leading an analytics team. And so I noticed 2 big themes while I was at this business. So one was, anytime I went to hire any kind of data professionals, so data analysts, data engineers, data scientists, I found it personally a massive pain in the ass So the process was, you put up a job ad on LinkedIn, or in Australia, we have Seek, like the big job platforms. You get all these applications through and you basically get a CV. And then from that CV, trying to pick through quickly and figure out who are the best candidates to interview. What I found consistently was that it was very hard to predict based on a CV alone who the best candidate was to speak to. So that meant that I have to do a lot of interviews to hire one person. I'd often get 5 minutes into an interview and realize the candidate who said they had XYZ advanced skills obviously didn't have those. And so I really wanted a more efficient, simpler, more objective way to screen candidates. So that was one origin. And the other piece was looking around at my colleagues and realizing that in a company of 150 people, we had maybe, I think, 6 or 7 data professionals, but then there are at least another 30 or 40 people, all the product managers, all the online marketers, the senior managers of the business, where if I looked at what they actually did day to day, it was basic analytics, even if they didn't think of themselves as an analyst. And so it's very clear to me that this data literacy thing was becoming more and more important.
Yeah. So it's like, it should be like a mandatory step in the journey for a good portion of the job would be, well, can you handle data? Do you know how to extract it, how to use it, how to interpret it? That makes sense. And then the other point you made, which is, the resumes are lying, right? That if you look at a hot space like the one you're in, where we know that salaries are inflated and that there is not enough talent. And so it's going to potentially attract people who are trying to find a shortcut to a better life, But I would guess there's some resumes that are kind of like packed with keywords that don't belong there.
Yeah, there's definitely some keyword stuffing. There's some inflation. There's also just, we're not the best judges of ourselves. And a really interesting data point that we collect directly on Alooba to kind of buttress this is that before a candidate starts a test, they rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 10 for each skill that we are about to assess them in. And then we compare their self-rating to their actual performance to come up with what we call the self-awareness index. And to cut a long story short, all our data shows that people consistently overestimate their skills. And that's true for any gender. It's not like more or less for men or women, like everyone does it. So we're not generally the best judges of ourselves. So that's part of it. But then it's not actually just the person writing the CV, it's also the person reviewing the CV. And what we've done in a really interesting experiment actually was we contracted a whole bunch of recruiters, gave them all the same set of 500 CVs, the same job description, and basically asked them, okay, shortlist who you think we should interview. And it was amazing. They all came back with different suggestions, almost like complete randomness. And behind the scenes, we also had these candidates' test performances, which we didn't expose. And so what we found was the CV screening often missed the best performing candidates anyway. So actually, if you were to almost flip a coin, that might have been a more accurate predictor than having someone look through the CV. And there could be any number of reasons for that. You can think of bias, like there's been some really interesting studies around callback rates on applications depending on your surname and the ethnicity of it and all those kinds of things. But yeah, in general, I think the CV is like a really weak data set to figure out who to interview.
Yeah, of course. And this experiment, I think, would prove, the randomness would be even higher if you go towards younger people. I mean, if somebody's got 20 years of experience, and the track record to show for it and professional references, then I think the resume is a little bit of a stronger indicator, right? But if you're looking for people in their 20s, then assessments is the way to go. So for those who are not experts and who've heard the word data science and data analysts, but don't know how to categorize this domain, could you give us a quick kind of summary of what are the different profiles within the data world so that people can organize their thoughts around that talent pool?
Yeah, for sure. And it has changed a lot even in the last few years. So it was only, I'd say, a few years ago where there was almost all one person. Everyone was looking for the sort of the holy grail unicorn person, does a bit of everything. But exactly. But now it's been split out. So yeah, definitely a data engineer, I would say, is basically the person responsible for the data pipelines. So responsible for getting data from A to B and getting it in a state that's easily analyzable. So they've cleaned it up, they've aggregated, they've wrangled it, it's kind of ready to go. The data analyst will then be responsible normally for visualizing the data, putting together reports, digging into like negative trends that they find in the data, and being probably the closest person to the business. So they'll be the ones actually, working with, let's say in the tech company, the product managers, the marketers, and helping them understand the data. And defining all those metrics. And then data scientists often work on more complicated problems. There's an expectation they'll have what I'd call like proper data science knowledge. So machine learning, maybe some more deep learning, natural language processing. And they're basically using more complicated statistics, often to do more like forecasting and predictions, sometimes as part of a product, sometimes as part of marketing, doesn't really matter. And there's, let's say, often a little bit further away from the business, maybe slightly less expectations of business acumen, doing less of the day-to-day stuff and working more on projects. That's the way I'd split them up.
And that sounds almost also like a chronological line, right? You need to have your data pipeline in order before you can analyze it. And then only after you've got a large enough data set can you bring in machine learning and NLP and that data science.
Yes. And you would think that. And I think a lot of the businesses only discovered that over the last few years, where they initially built out advanced data science teams only to realize the things you've just pointed out, which is if you don't have the data pipelines and the data's not clean, then it doesn't matter how good your algorithms are. If the data's crap, then your outcomes are going to be
guilty as charged. I made that mistake.
Speaking from bitter experience then.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're loaded on data engineering now and still have to sort out through a lot of data because at Talkpush we process millions of data points every day, and it's just a tremendous cleanup job.
It is,
before we can extract anything meaningful out of it. And so, well, let's imagine somebody is not a customer of Alooba, but still wants to interview a data engineer, a data analyst, and figure out who's right for the job. What are some good interview tips and methodologies that you can offer our audience?
Yes, I think interviews are a really interesting space, and we're going to start working on some products in that area soon. From our research, what we seem to think is that interviews tend to be in quite an unstructured way on average, which makes them potentially very subjective. And our vision for interviews is to try to help companies do them in as structured and therefore as an objective way as possible. Just as a quick anecdote, like I've done many interviews in the last year myself, sometimes with someone else in our business. And it's really fascinating that you get to the end of the interview, and if you sit there and do your own evaluations of the candidate independently, you'll straight away see the problem. And that is that you'll often have very diverging opinions over how the candidate performed on any particular thing. So you might say, I thought they were great on this bit, and your colleague might say they were terrible. So trying to find a way to make it as objective as possible is really what we're going for. I think that starts with just defining very clearly before you even start hiring what exactly you're looking for in the candidate, what are the requirements of the role, and then setting up each stage of the hiring process, be that an interview, a test, some other process, to just match exactly that and nothing else. So I think where companies often fall down is they just add extraneous steps that's gone really well, but speak to Joe first or have a quick chat with this person. And there's so much moving of the goalposts, we call it in Australia. So just trying to have as clearly a structured process as possible, down to the question level, I'd say. If we're going to interview this candidate, define ahead of time, what are the 10 questions you're going to ask and why? These 3 questions relate to this skill, which we've identified as essential. These 2 questions relate to this trait, which we've identified as essential. Then within that, try to have a scoring methodology. So you might have, let's say for a particular question you're going to ask, like what would be a good answer? What would be an okay answer? What would be a bad answer? And try to think of that ahead of time, if possible, so then you can more objectively categorize the candidate's answer into each of those buckets. And then hopefully...
It's so hard to do those things on the fly, right? Because you have to have empathy towards your audience and to read their answers and listen. So you can't think of your questions during the interview. You really have to prepare for it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, so let's get into a little bit more granular then. What are some interview questions that we can ask for data engineers or data analysts? Am I right in saying that data analyst is perhaps the more junior role of the 3, or the one where there's the most number of talents, and then data engineer is a little bit harder to find, data scientist is the hardest?
Possibly, yeah. I'd say there are more entry-level data analyst roles, and I'd say the skill set is a bit less technical than either a data scientist or engineer. I think that's a fair comment, yeah.
Okay, so let's hone in on these guys, on the data analysts that are a little bit more junior, because those are the hardest interviews, the ones with people who don't have a lot of experience.
Yes.
Yeah, I know your go-to move would be, well, let's move them to an assessment as fast as possible. And if somebody that is not a customer of yours, what kind of assessments can they build at home?
So I'd say any good hiring process probably has a combination of things in it. I think absolutely you should interview candidates. I just think there's also some value add to testing their skills somehow, whether that's through a take-home assignment, whether that's through something like our platform, either way. And I think it's a case of thinking about what things you're trying to evaluate and whether or not they're better to evaluate in an interview or a test. So for example, anything that's more of a soft skill, I'd say you're better off trying to evaluate in an interview. It's a lot easier to test someone's communication skills, their decision making, those types of things in an interview. Anything that's a bit more technical and a bit more black and white, for example, like writing SQL or Python coding or those types of basic statistical and machine learning knowledge, I'd say put that into a test for a couple of reasons. One is you'll be able to assess a lot more things in the same period of time as what you could in an interview. Like in an interview, it's going to take at least a few minutes to go through each question, whereas in a test, you could ask 3 or 4 questions in a couple of minutes and gather more data points, and do that in a completely apples for apples way, where every candidate has identical amount of time. They've been asked the questions in the same way, like everything's held the same. So I'd say, yeah, figure out what you're trying to assess and split it into a test or an interview. For the interview part of things, yeah, so for those kind of softer skills and whatnot, again, I'd try to think ahead of time of how you're going to categorize what good communication skills are, as an example. Something like that is actually quite vague in terms of what good communication skills are. Like, are you looking for they easily understood you and answered your questions? Are you looking for them being really articulate? Are they meant to be charismatic? When we talk to companies who we've worked with and they've said, oh, their communication skills weren't good enough, you dig in a couple of layers and you realize that means so many things to so many different people. Yeah. Same for the cultural fit thing. Like those types of things, I'd be really careful with anything that's very subjective. And I'd just try to find a way to define it.
Yeah, and back to your earlier point about people not being able to assess themselves, even if you ask somebody, how are your communication skills? There's a certain set of people who will rate themselves poorly, even though they have impeccable vocabulary, grammar fluency, understanding, comprehension. But because they're not the popular kids in high school, they just think, oh, my communication skills aren't good. Exactly. So that makes sense. Yeah. So the assessment part where you're asking them to write SQL or do some Python coding and so on, is that something that is easy for a small company to put in place without a professional tool, which is time-bound, controlled, password protected, or does that open the gates to some cheating? How do you feel about sort of homegrown testing on these things?
I think it depends on the scale of the company and who's already there. So if you already had an analytics team built out with the skills to create those assessments and evaluate them, I think potentially it makes sense to do that. The other upside is you can use your own data sets and craft exactly what you need. And if you're willing to wait for the candidate to be able to complete this, often it'll take like a week to go through and you'll have to evaluate it. If you're willing to do that, then you can get some quite deep insights because you can basically give them effectively real work to do. I don't think anything will ever be as strong a predictor as that, like just giving them literally what they would work on and seeing how they go. The downside is really the time it takes the candidate and yourself to evaluate it, especially in this current market. That is going to probably deter some candidates from completing it. The other thing is that you'll be struck down with scale. Like you probably can't assess more than 5 candidates in a week. Your team, you probably want your data analyst doing data analysis, not grading assessments. So there's probably some upside to using a platform because it's all kind of set up there waiting for you. The questions are created, the tests are ready, the whole platform works, etc.
Okay. Well, I normally keep this question for the end, but I'll ask you now. So if somebody wants to find out how Alooba can help with the selection of data professionals, how do they get in touch with you? And who's your ideal customer? Who's your ideal customer, and how do they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so we normally work with either large enterprises or high growth tech companies. And that's probably because they're the ones who hire the most in analytics and data science. So it makes sense they have the biggest problem to solve. And they can get in touch with us at our website, alooba.com. That's ALOOBA.com. And there's just a form there you can fill in to book a discovery call. We'll just start with a quick chat to understand basically your hiring process, your pain points, and then potentially suggest how we could help.
Great. And now what is actually my last question, which is the one I ask all my guests, is to walk us back through a hiring mistake that you personally made, and without giving out names, recall a time when you hired somebody, made a hiring mistake, and walk us through the steps of that mistake so that we can learn from your mistake and try to avoid making one ourselves.
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me contemplate on that one.
Are you seeing some ghosts flash before your eyes?
Exactly. Some very recent ghosts as well. I think, to be honest, that getting people right for our business has probably been one of our biggest challenges. So this is really hard. Everyone has my full empathies on how hard it is to find the right people. I can think of a few people. So they fit into quite different categories. Some would fit into the category of us maybe over-indexing on skills, maybe drinking a bit of our own Kool-Aid, right? Like saying, okay, maybe skills is all that matters, and neglecting what I'd call values alignment, let's say. Mm-hmm. So after we went through that stage, this is about 18 months ago, we sat down and thought really clearly about like what our values are at the company. Like, what do we want our people to be like from a values perspective? We got them incredibly concrete. And after that point, we then embedded them into our hiring process. So we now ask hiring questions at various stages of the process to cover up those values. So we weren't just focused on could they technically do the job. So that was, I guess, one big trend. Another one was probably over-indexing on people that I'd known already and I was comfortable with, and assuming that they could transition into quite a different role in a different type of business environment, and maybe also underappreciating how difficult it is to sell different types of products. Yeah. And learning that new domain of software sales and software marketing, and how much of a transition that can be if you've been in other environments.
Okay, yeah. I'll latch on to the first one you said. This reminds me of a chat I recently had with the Time Doctor CEO, who said that he mandates the culture fit assessment before the technical assessment, because otherwise, in a market where technical skills are in such high demand, it skews the rest of the hiring process. You have somebody who aces the assessment and who's like super great on a technical level, then you're going to kind of ignore all the red flags that come afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a careful balancing act, I think, because some companies can use cultural fit to mean anything. Like, you can exclude anyone in any hiring process for cultural fit. Yet we know that it matters. Having certain types of people to work in a certain way is really important. I think it's just about, can we more objectively, concretely define what cultural fit is, to then make sure we evaluate candidates as fairly as possible.
You almost need like a Chinese wall between the person who evaluates values and technical skills, so that, you know, they don't influence each other. They can both come up with their own independent scores, regardless of in which order you do it. Well, Tim, it's been really educational, and thank you for sharing your knowledge on how to hire data professionals, and all the best to Alooba.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Max. It's been a great afternoon.
That was Tim Freestone from Alooba, reminding us that technical assessments are no substitute for making sure your candidates had the right values aligned with your company values, and giving us some few tips on how to prepare for an interview for data professionals. Hope you enjoyed it, and that you'll be back for more. Please subscribe to the Recruitment Hackers podcast and share with friends.